So we are going to start, and just to introduce the film, my name is Dewan Afzal. I'm originally from Bangladesh, and of course, you all know Bangladesh is one of the countries is already affected, and 1/3 of Bangladesh will go under the water. So this is why in 2008, myself and Rita Bijon and Adriana Mongato Hamu, three of us, we walked from Toronto to Ottawa to make people aware of the global warming. And this film also give you idea about what is going to happen. The global warming, the trend which going on, what will happen. So this is why I'm going to read from the producer of this film, and he has written a sentence about the film, and then of course you are going to enjoy the film, and then of course you take the information with you, and we have to make sure that this election is important, that we elect people who cares for our environment, our climate. He's the writer, and he's saying climate change is the threat multiplier for overpopulation, overconsumption, and lack of natural resources. Our mission is to create a platform that will illuminate the facts about climate refugees, their lack of international protection, our national security issues, and solution to this civilization-altering issue. And this film was actually filmed in Bangladesh, Belgium, Chad, China, Denmark, Fiji, France, Germany, Holland, Ireland, Kenya, Maldives, Poland, Switzerland, Tuvalu, and of course, Tuvalu already water is taken over Tuvalu, UK, and the USA. So enjoy the film. Thank you.
A couple of weeks, a workshop on biophilia, and so I realized that I'm in that group. Our first speaker this evening is Laura Westra, and Laura comes with many academic credentials, and I will only draw into a couple of them because we will be here for a very long time if I went on. Laura Westra is Professor Emerita in Philosophy, University of Windsor, and has a couple of PhDs. The one that I guess we're looking at tonight is the PhD in law. And I'd like to draw attention to your very recent publication, Globalization, Violence, and World Governance. I believe that's happening right now.
I hope that I will have now the PowerPoint. No, my PowerPoint. That young lady has my PowerPoint. I sent it.
It's asking you to talk.
Is this environmental justice and the rights of ecological refugees? Why I call them ecological rather than
Hold it up. Can't hear you, so
hold it up.
My work have to go there, right? I'm sorry, start again. I think the main topic for us tonight is environmental justice and the rights of ecological refugees. And this is my 2009 book. It's a third of a trilogy on environmental justice. You can hear me now. The one was on environmental justice and the rights of unborn and future generations. And the second one was environmental justice and the rights of indigenous peoples, and this is the third one. Now, the book to which the lady who just spoke referred to is this one here. Just came out. but I don't have time to speak of it because I've been allotted 15 minutes. And I certainly cannot cover the topic of 2 books in that time. If you're interested, I have flyers of all of them. And I don't know what else I can say other than go there and get to work. And I hope to then explain to you just why I'm referring to ecological rather than just climate or environmental refugees. There is a difference, I believe, and it should become clearer as I speak with you. Yes, law. That was my second PhD, and I apologize to anyone who has heard this talk before. Our president of Science for Peace, Judy Deutsch, is aware of it. I see just maybe 1 or 2 people who were there the last time I presented, but that's what she chose and that's what I will do. So, the big problem is that there is no law to protect them. You might say, yes, we can change light bulbs and this and that, but that's fine. But that isn't going to solve the problem right now, when even the auditorium in which we are listening to this is far more air conditioned than is necessary on a night when it's 7 degrees outside. I've just come back from a speaking engagement in Los Angeles. It was 20 degrees and windy there at Loyola University. It was absolutely wonderful. And the air conditioning made it, I don't know, maybe 16 or something, or 17, brutally air conditioning, enough to get sick. And it was a meeting, again, on climate change. So, I mean, this is something that recurs constantly. Any of you who have gone to conferences in the US, you know it's far worse than this. Anyway, El Hinawi said that running away is the best way to get away from danger. And I think he's certainly correct. Now, if you look at the, what that describes, they are defined as those people who are forced to leave their homes, their place of residence for one reason or another, temporarily or permanently, because of a marked environmental disruption. Now, marked environmental disruptions, not only due to climate change, they come in other ways too. Now, unfortunately, unfortunately, what we have is definitions of refugees that simply have nothing to do with the hundreds of thousands of refugees from everywhere. Whether it is running away from Japan, Northeast Japan, and believe me, I'm well aware of that. I have a son that teaches at Nagoya University in Japan, Southwest, but still, the distances are not that great. And the dangers are huge. Well, those are environmental refugees. But are they purely environmental? I call them ecological refugees because of the exposures that they have to face, the danger that these exposures bring. Now, according to laws, that is the definition of refugees. There is unfortunately, there is a document that dates from 1951. 1951 is right after the Second World War, so that the definition is supposed to fit primarily single individuals or individuals who are escaping hazardous conditions because of their religion, their ethnic background, their social milieu. Not people who are escaping because of exposures of any sort, be they radioactive or environmental or what have you. And then, of course, at first, the conventions was in 51, it was about people who had already faced those conditions. Then there was a 1967 protocol which went further and said before or after. Okay, but still, it doesn't get us where we want to go. Sure, there are lawyers here who specialize in Toronto on refugee issues. And what are those refugees? Well, the refugees that come to Toronto are the ones who escape from various dangerous situations. But the dangerous situations have nothing to do with climate, with exposure, be they chemical, radioactive, or whatnot. If you are a refugee, say for argument's sake, from Iran, and you're a homosexual, and your life is in danger in your country, well, you can ask Canada for asylum if you're lucky enough to get here. But what does that have to do with the hundreds of thousands of people that are fleeing conditions that are unbearable in all continents? That is the question. All right. What are the roots of the problems? Unfortunately, I will not be able to go over this given the short time that I have. So I'm asking you just to take a look. There's a whole bunch of different problems that we're encountering, and the fact that in general, chemicals, and that's the one where I really want to focus on, chemical and hazardous situations are not monitored. There are thousands of chemicals that have come out, Better Living with Chemistry, if you remember, that have come out after the Second World War, which are untested. Or even if one or two are tested, they're never tested as to the harms that they would produce when they get together. Cumulative harms, aggregate harms are just simply not tested for anything. All right. So it is the question of definition. That is the definition. And I know you're not interested in the details of law, but you need to ask yourself, how can we continue to live with a definition from 1951 that has nothing to do with the current world situation, so that hundreds of thousands of people who are in dire straits because of our own practices, because the people who do the damage, the people who air condition the auditorium are not the same people in Tuvalu or anywhere else who suffer the effect. And then there is another group of people that technically you might call, have more, you might think have a bit more resemblance to the group we are talking about. And that is the internally displaced persons. For instance, in Japan, those people who were displaced by the hazards of their own area are not the sort of people that come to our shores, and maybe they're not welcome, or the sort of people that arrive to the shores of my own country, Italy, in Lampedusa. Hundreds of thousands of them, constantly in boats, running away from the conditions they have at home. They're not those people. Not at all. These are people who are internally displaced, say in Japan. They have no law to protect them either. And to let you know that, okay? Just doesn't exist. So there are several grounds to establish the reasons why you may have a claim to refugee status. And here they are. And notice that economic reasons or any reason that connect to your survival, water, lack of water, drought, all sorts of things that may affect the way that you can no longer survive are simply not included. That doesn't make any difference. You're not allowed refugee status for them. Does the state protect you? Well, I'm afraid not. It does not. Their own states do not protect them, and the states where they arrive, even Canada, which is certainly a civilized, so-called democratic state, does not protect them. They sit in a boat somewhere, and maybe they might be allowed to go on shore. Australia, same story. You are shoved out. In some cases, you're refused entry. So it is a very, very difficult situation for all these folks who simply cannot guarantee the rights of people. Whereas I would think probably that the first thing that a state should guarantee is indeed our right to survival. And unfortunately, that is not the case in a country like Canada, but also in European countries. I don't want to single us out. There are people who work to separate deserving from undeserving refugees, especially when they start throwing around the world the word terrorist instead of freedom fighters. They've lost to begin with. If they have to escape their regime, if their state will not defend them, we will not accept them, and we will not defend them either. Now, for the most part, there is a strong role on the part of race and ethnicity in refugees, and especially when we are talking about persons who are living off the land. I'm talking about indigenous peoples in all continents, starting with First Nations in Canada. Now, First Nations in Canada have very strong ties to the land. They have traditional ties, but also religious ties. So that even if you take a group of people from a First Nation and you say, well, we will relocate you, that doesn't mean that the problem is solved. Okay? That's why I'm talking about ecological refugees. This is not necessarily a climate situation. They might be exposed to various toxic and hazardous effluents of some sort. They may be very close to tar sands. They may be close to corporate operations, particularly mining and other extractive industries that have practices in order to do whatever they have to do, say, get gold. And Canada is very well known for having a lot of mining and extracting corporations all over the world. When they go next to an area, say where there are indigenous people who live off the land, the water that they desperately need to grow whatever subsistence crops they have, and also for their families, is gone. Why? Because corporations use them. They need them. I refer to gold. Think, for instance, about a corporation like Glamis Gold. Okay, they produce gold. How do they produce gold? First they extract something from the ground, and then they need cyanide ponds to process it. When those cyanide ponds leak, unfortunately, in the food of other people, the result is not happy. And the result is not safe. This is just one example. Almost any extractive or mining industry will be hazardous to people that live off that land, that need those specific areas to survive. The food they can get from it, say the fish they can fish from the area, and so on. So there are indigenous and non-indigenous people who are environmental refugees, if you want to call them that, or simply displaced persons. Okay? And of course, one of the indigenous groups that is most affected right now, and I think we know that, and again, I hark back to the question of religion and specific social groups, although it's what I'm saying to you is speculative. I don't want you to think that, in fact, the convention, the legal convention, is applied in that way. It is not. Think of the people from the Arctic, Inuit people. Canadian Inuit people, you move them from there, what? Sure, you can save them individually as people. You can save their life by moving them from an area where they cannot survive, for argument's sake. Move them what? In a suburb in Toronto? But as a people, they cannot survive like that. This is very much the case of the Shishmaref group in Kivalina, in Alaska, where the American people simply ignore their plight, and although they tried to sue the American government for what was happening to them, which is simply a complete meltdown of the ice underneath their town. Not only that, but also a meltdown of the barrier, the ice barrier that blocked the worst storms from coming. So they're assaulted by storms from the top, they're melting from the bottom. And this is not just the particular group of the Hispanic who recognize that, but it's also the American, the US Corps of Engineers who say it will take about at least 500,000 to move them somewhere else. Well, Science for Peace has my PowerPoint, but the book is there, and it's out since 2009. And the book regarding the weakness of the UN and all that is this one here, and I'm going to leave a few flyers if anybody's interested. They're all in Amazon. Unfortunately, they're not cheap because they're hardcovers. They cost me a lot of money if I want to buy them. if I want to buy it, over $100. So, anyone else? Yes, yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You talk about the shortcomings. Is there any government that's actually working on changing any of the laws, or kind of like a vanguard for change?
I'm afraid I wish I could say yes. There have been academic efforts like the one that I mentioned from the University of Limoges group that got together, Francophone. But there is nothing that is official. That is the problem. There is nothing official. Changing conventions is the hardest thing to do. Even the ones we have are not observed and respected properly. So, how to get a new one? I wish. And I should say that those of you who are lawyers may want to look for ways of finding that. Me, I just had a PhD in law. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't go into court. I can give material to those who want to fight, but I can fight myself.
I just want to mention on this effect that there's a group in Britain that has organized itself to prosecute climate criminals. And if you put climate criminal into Google, you'll find them. And they're identifying climate criminals as government ministers who have pushed policies that, like tar sands, for instance, in Canada, that continue to destroy our current environment, and business people who are lobbying for unnecessary goods. So there's one group that one can look at.
Thank you very much. Could you please tell me whether they've had any success? Because the Kivalina had a case which seems so obvious. You know, they're all sinking into the sea. They used lawyers from San Francisco sued the American government, talking about a public nuisance and a civil conspiracy. The public nuisance went just, and the civil conspiracy, they had proofs that 23 oil companies, starting with Exxon, paid millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars to distribute wrong advertising, saying that climate change, A, doesn't exist, and if it exists, it's good for you, right? And do you remember the tobacco story? Smoking is good for you, right? It took a long time before we had a convention. I'm afraid this is going to take even longer because people who are actually dropping dead like flies from diseases engendered by tobacco are more easily seen here and now than people who are victims of climate and other problems.
Have the questions afterwards. And I'm going to go by the person on my right, who is Alfredo Barahona, who came to Canada in 1985 as a refugee from El Salvador, where he experienced clear signs of climate change, such as hurricanes and floods. He currently works with Kairos as program coordinator in the area of migrant and indigenous rights. Alfredo is a member of the World Council of Churches Global Ecumenical Network on Migration, where climate change and forced migration are key issues of concern. Well then, should I introduce Tim as well, and then each of you decide who's going to speak first? I'll wait. Professor Tim Leduc is a professor at York University and the Faculty of Environmental Studies. This past January, in the heart of winter, he published Climate, Culture, Change, Inuit and Western Dialogues with a Warming North. In this book, Professor Leduc aims to integrate the Inuit experience of climate change with Western climate research and includes an anecdote companion to the volume, making it accessible across cultures. To find out more, you can go to climateculturechange.wordpress.com, and his book has already sold out and is currently being reprinted, and it will be available locally in the very near future.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Rita and Tom. It's a great honor to be here and to be able to talk to this wonderful and quite scary at times and hopeful at other times movie. I don't know how other people felt watching it, but my heart dropped many times, and then thinking, how do I actually have to come up here and talk to it afterwards? But there was a lot of hope there as well, and so I want to talk about those kinds of two faces to climate change that Michael Nash helped put on for us in this documentary. In one of his interviews that I read, I hadn't watched the documentary before tonight, so I went around the internet and read various interviews with Michael Nash, and the thing he consistently said is that he was trying to put the human face back on climate change. And that's definitely what's going to haunt me over the next few days. There was that Bangladesh mother who couldn't hold on to her child with the water tide. The Tuvula grandmother wondering what she's going to do. Then there's the other side. The one individual talking about the UNFCCC and all the suits, and not having a sense of real need and need to do something. And it made me think, I talk about in my book in relation to, I end the book in Copenhagen. And at Copenhagen there were 141 private jets parked at the airport.
Oh, Christ.
They shipped in 1,200 limousines to transport dignitaries around. You know, this is very similar to what Laura was talking about in relation to air conditioning. You know, that's a climate change negotiation, and yet some of our basic structures are implicated in the actual processes that we're trying to solve. Lester Brown talking about the WW2 analogy, which I think is a really interesting analogy, and he wrote an article about that exact analogy in Tikkun magazine, and I've just written a response to it. And I think it's a really interesting possibility, but at the same time, we have to recognize there's a significant difference. That was in response, that came after Pearl Harbor, and we have an external scapegoat to mobilize the population against. And what we're talking about in climate change, we're talking about ourselves. And it's been very hard to get some mobilization. Climate denial is able to get in and limit action by not wanting us to actually think about the way in which we're implicated in this. So I want to focus, bring what we saw in climate refugees back to Canada in this moment of an important election. A very important election in regards to, you know, what is the face of climate change that Canadians are going to present to the world. This documentary highlighted for me what I think is the most essential, and what I talk about in the book in my book as being the most essential issue with climate change. And that is that it's through and through a specific human, or as I argue, industrial cultural issue. It's not an external climate phenomenon. It's about our lifestyle and our choices. It's impacting many different ways of life, and we saw that in this film, from Bangladesh to New Orleans, or in the Canadian context of my book, from the warming Hudson Bay waters in Nunavut to the Alberta tar sands. These are two sides of the same coin. Now, according to Michael Nash, a climate refugee is someone who is forced to leave their land because they really can no longer survive there, and is forced to move somewhere else. The global dimensions of climate change means that there are currently 25 million refugees, climate refugees, as he talked about, which is a bigger number than political and religious refugees, as Laura was talking about as well. Some estimates suggest that this number will grow to around 200 million climate refugees by 2050. So this is a really serious issue. For those of us here in North America and in Canada, our instant assumption, and something that was again talked about in this documentary, is that this is happening somewhere else. But we saw with New Orleans, for example, that there's climate refugees within the North American borders. Lester Joel Brown in the film said that Katrina had 1 million evacuees and 300,000 did not return. In Canada, I and many others have been talking with Inuit about their experience of the weather changes, or in Inuit terms, Sila changes, Sila weather. And the impacts it has on the local terrain, the impacts it's having on animals, and thus the impact it is having on their traditional hunting way of life, and the Inuit knowledge system itself. As one Inuit hunter said to me, Inuit Kajin or IQ as I put it up here, was real because things were stable, but the seal has so changed that IQ is pretty much gone. It can no longer predict because of the change in climate. This is a loss of not simply the land or simply a way of life, but it's a whole knowledge system, whole cultural ways of being and thinking. Based on current impacts and future projections, the IPCC proposes that northern peoples like Inuit may in the near future no longer be able to practice their traditional hunting ways of living and will have to be centralized in globally interconnected urban hubs. This is something I talk about in relation to the history of colonialism, with regards to the moving populations. And who, as Sheila Wakuche has said a number of times, we have the right to be cold. Inuit have the right to be cold, and the kind of impacts it has on their culture. So, is this a kind of description of climate refugees within Canadian borders? This is not happening somewhere else, it's happening here. It is interesting and important to point out that underlying all these climate displacements is a cultural way of living that refuses to change. A way of life that, using Nash's climate refugees definition in an analogous way, can no longer survive because it is unsustainable, but refuses to move somewhere else. That is, it refuses to live differently and move from our cultural land of comfort, our cultural land of assumed ways of living. My book looks at this cultural face of climate change in our Canadian context, and I want to briefly highlight how we can see it playing out in the current election, despite the limited discussion of the climate change issue that has occurred in this election. With only a few days left in the election campaign, many of you have probably seen the many conservative TV commercials and radio commercials, but there's one I want to focus on. It begins with all these natural images of Canada, the trees, snows, mountain, and then you start hearing Stephen Harper's voice come in, and then the cozy images of Stephen Harper, the ones that you don't get to see too often actually in action outside of an election campaign. And then we hear his voice. We want Canada to be a true north as strong as it is free. And he goes on, and he ends that is why we are here. That is why we serve. Canada is a model to the world. Canada as a northern country. This is something that's been central to Stephen Harper's policies and to his vision that he promotes in his Canadian politics ever since he's come into power. He has been particularly interested in the melting Northwest Passage, though it's interesting to point out that he rarely, if ever, mentions climate change in relation to that. He does not want to mention climate change in relation to that because it opens up a whole other bag of worms. His speeches and images offer a more romantic and less socially conscious view of climate change, one that draws upon the traditional image of Canadians as northerners working the frontier, a people in search of the wealth related to a fabled Northwest Passage, a country rich with resources that are a source of economic wealth, sovereignty, and recreation, as in our many beer commercials that show us also playing in the north, and a frontier history that stretches from fur trade to tar sands to melting Northwest Passage. This is part of who we are. And these images, I suggest he uses because they have cultural resonance, and that he can use that as almost a way to conceal what he wants to do. It draws people into his Canadian model that is economically self-interested, but simultaneously denies the reality of climate change and its potential impacts on people, whether it be Inuit or the many different examples we saw in the Climate Refugees documentary. This denial is the Canadian face of climate change right now on an international scale. At least the one that he has been politically represented globally ever since he came into power. I want to end with a different sense, a different face that we can put on Canada, and a different sense of the Canadian North. One that I argue has a longer history than the resources, greenhouse gas emitting vision promoted by Harper, and can inspire a more compassionate face for Canadians. One Inuit elder I refer to in my book made the following statement: "The North cannot be lived alone." I found such an Inuit sensibility, social sensibility, reflected in traditional hunting rituals and in Inuit knowledge, in the Inuit knowledge system itself, Inuit Kajimutakaji. How do you bring different kinds of knowledges together? How is our knowledge embedded within broader contexts, broader ecological contexts, familial contexts? All of these contextual understandings, these social understandings, arose in response to a northern reality, and how do you actually live in that northern reality, a social response. It's and a social reality, a northern reality, that is not fully controllable, that is not fully knowable, but yet we can still live with it. These are similar issues we're dealing with in climate change. And I think somebody like John Ralston Saul's A Fair Country offers another interesting vision on Canada that draws upon those same images of Canada as North, and the kind of social meanings that we've traditionally had between different knowledges and different kinds of systems. That could be a vision into the future. This kind of social etiquette, if you want, this kind of social approach to the North, makes me think of one series of dialogues I had, which I'm going to end with JPT Yarnica, who is an Inuit writer, former policy worker, and somebody who I met back in 2003 here in Toronto at a university lecture he was presenting. We entered into a dialogue for about 5 years. And this dialogue is the backbone of the book. It gets into some of the nuances of Inuit understandings. And we ended up talking about how Inuit understandings can transform how we think about Western climate science and Western politics. Almost a year after our dialogue began, he asked me, why don't researchers ever ask us about wisdom, or in Inuktitut, Sila Tunik? You know, and I'm interested in culture, and I'm interested in religious perspectives, but I didn't ask him that question. He stressed to me that wisdom, Sila Tunik, should be of central importance to anyone concerned with climate change. This Sila Tunik came up as we were talking about Sila, the weather, and the weather changes that are happening in relation to the North. Sila, weather, Sila Tunik, and the connection. It's beyond, the weather in this conception is beyond just the physical properties of weather out there. It has to do with the way in which we are connected. Our breath is connected to the weather system. The way in which our breath and our internal ways of living and thinking are connected to that which is happening in the external, the way in which we have to mimic the two. One shaman, when you look at the old ethnographies, you find Sila mentioned in relation to shamanic perspectives.
2 hours is getting to me, so I don't know how you guys are doing there. You have heard Professor Ledoki, Professor Westra, you've seen the video or the film, and I'm sure you have read tons and tons of materials related to climate change and how that impacts on the whole issue of migration and refugees and so on and so forth. So what I try to do very briefly, with your permission, is just to maybe offer a little bit of anecdotal, if you want, trying to bring the human aspect of this whole thing into the discussion, which the film also tries to do. Because I'm always concerned with the balance, in everything we do, the balance between the academic research and the people in suits and the forums at the UN with the actual people who are living the issues. So it's a concern that I always have, and I have to keep reminding myself of that because I'm also part of everything that is going on. But I remember a few years ago, I had an opportunity to sit with my mother, my father, and of course, I'm sure you've done this too. I asked my parents to tell me a little bit about what was life for them when they were growing up. And by that time, we were already here in Canada. And they started telling me, well, do you remember the road that ended in such and such point in San Salvador, where the city where I grew up? And I said, yes, I do remember that. And he said, well, right at the bottom of that street, there used to be a river. So the words, right? There used to be a river. And there was a lagoon, a small lake, right? I don't know what the word in English would be, but it's small water, like a pond. Well, that didn't exist. I never saw that, but they spoke to me about it. You know, the river that used to come down from the small volcano in San Salvador. Well, it was something like that in the film as well, right? In China, where all the, you know, in the Tibetan region where all the rivers are dry. Well, you know, that it was happening a long time ago. They described it to me. And then I asked them, okay, tell me more or less the time period when you remember that the river was there, because my father, especially my father, was telling me we used to go there and swim, and we used to go there and have so much fun when I was growing up, when he was a child. So I said, okay, tell me more or less the time. So I calculated and estimated that he was talking about a period of 30 years for that river to dry out and then the pond to dry out as well. But that is just one example. I do remember the long lineups, and you also saw it then in the refugee camps in the films, right? I mean, people lining up with a whole bunch of water recipients or water containers to go and collect water. Well, we used to that. We deal with that as well. There were water charges. I remember also a hurricane, right? And then it was, I don't know if you guys remember that, but it was, in El Salvador, we call it the Hurricane Fifi or something like that. I don't know what the English word would be there, you know. But it was, I remember that it rained and rained and rained non-stop for at least 3 to 5 days. And then all of a sudden, and of course we didn't go to school, we had to stay there because, you know, it was too much rain, and then the flooding and all of that. And then all of a sudden a huge bang, you know, like noise, right? Well, what happened was that part of the wall from an apartment building just gave up from absorbing or soaking into, you know, the water, right? So it just gave up, and then the whole thing sort of collapsed. Luckily, there was nobody in the room with that particular apartment, so nobody was killed. But to me, it was like, you know, what's going on in here, right? And then I started also hearing stories, once again to Canada, precisely about the North, right? And how, you know, people from the region could not hunt anymore. Their way of life was being affected and so on. So to me, climate change has been, it's always been there. And I also, you know, often wonder, you know, how many more papers, how many more books, how many more briefings, political briefings, how many more presentations, how many more films do we need in order to stop this and to change this? But then I think, well, maybe you're asking the wrong question, or you're asking the wrong questions to, you know, Alfredo, you're asking the wrong question yourself. It's not about books, it's not about presentation, it's about life. It's about people, it's about us. There's only so much that we can, there's only so much time, even time. If we're talking about limited resources, well, time is limited too, right? We don't have that much time. So I want to be brief, and I want to give you the microphone, and if we have a little bit more time, I don't know how long I'm going to be here, but if you have any questions, I'd rather, you know, dialogue with you, because I think that you've been sitting there for too long. So thanks, Rita, and thanks to the organizers. I sincerely appreciate the opportunity, but it's been a long day.
Would you like to come to the microphone?
First of all, thank you to the presenters and organizers for tonight. And I'm just aware of how much we all know, probably most of us in this room. This is not a new topic for us. The question is how to mobilize. And I will say, how do we get education out to others? And I will recommend this Dominion paper, which is out at the front. It's absolutely excellent, with a chart in the middle by Drew Oche. I think that really illustrates what we're up against. And if you show that to other people, I find most people don't know. So this morning on the coverage, I don't know how many people were watching about the wedding of Diana, but the next wedding. But the commentator on CTV talked about thanking global warming for the improved climate in Britain and being able to sunbathe in Scotland. That was on the TV this morning, and this is the degree of misinformation and misunderstanding out there. People really don't get that this is about climate chaos, the images that we saw in this film. So I want to say that it's really all up to us, and I say to myself too, how can I bring this to family members, for example, that don't pay attention to this the way I do? We all need to think about how we can do that and mobilize, and of course the election in the next few days is one way of mobilizing, and if we can send out to people about projectdemocracy.ca and Lead Now and some of the links that have to do with getting a much better, more aware members of parliament in, then we should definitely be doing that. And I will point out to you that there's flyers out there about a Voice of Women event, because that's an organization I'm involved with, around military spending. And it's the money that they want to spend on the military. Harper wants to put billions into these fighter jets and trillions in military spending around the world. That's the money that we need to do the windmills and the positive things that are in this film about what we need to do. So 2:30 on Sunday, there is a program about military spending in Canada, and there's flyers about that. But I think mainly we just need to think creatively, how can each of us take the message out and really see ourselves as mobilizers.
I have a question. I don't know too much about politics, but what I understand is that people in position of power are the ones supporting Harper. Most of the people across Canada are supporting Harper, and they are the ones who have the knowledge. If there is somebody from the population that has the knowledge about everything we talk, are the people in position of power. They have education, they have traveled, they have read books, they have watched the documentaries in the last 10 years. How can you explain to me that so many people keep supporting Harper? Any other politician that goes for the destruction of, like the tar sands, perfect example. Somebody just gave up from York University a great presentation about the tar sands, and it seems that First Nations people are not doing any more demonstrations. It has to stop. Like, she gave us, the person who gave us a report of what's happening there is, the people who are working are not happy campers. And a lot of the toxic environment, we need to learn more about that. And it has to come before the election, because it seems that people know, but they don't talk about it. I'd like to understand, why are people, the majority, supporting politicians that are destroying it, that allow for more destruction of the land?
I'll bring up a few different things, and I'm going to go back to Copenhagen. Prior to Copenhagen, the friend, I don't know how many people know the group, the Friends of Science. So you know, the Friends of Science is this group that presents themselves as very science-based, but then promote a bunch of climate denial. Basically, and they have, you know, when Stephen Harper was first elected, they put an ad out in the National Post saying, you know, climate change is real, and then all these different scientists who signed, and most of them are not actually climate scientists, and the few climate scientists that were there haven't published since the 60s or 70s, basically. So, what does that mean in relation to your comment? Well, for me, part of what the climate denial industry does is instill doubt. So I'm going to a conference, an environmental conference, I'm listening on the radio, I hear Friends of Science before Copenhagen saying that climate change isn't a real issue. Oh, and by the way, did you see the recent graphs that say there's been no progressive warming over the past 10 years, which again was, you know, not real science. There was all kinds of issues with that. But they use these different kinds of things to instill doubt in people. There's been documentaries on this. The people who are in this group are the same people who were against banning tobacco. They just moved from tobacco to climate, many of them. And so when we want to think about, that's one part of it, but then I think there is a part of us that doesn't want to believe And I can talk about this in relation to my own family. People in my own family who know I do spend my time doing stuff on climate change. And we get home and we have to have these debates about whether or not it's actually a human issue. And I think people just don't want to believe that it's related to their own patterns of behavior. They don't want to think that they're actually impacting their children and things like that. And so whenever the climate denial industry comes on with their ads, they're like, oh, that sounds good to me. I'm going to listen to that science because that's just another scientific perspective on this issue. And so that's where Harper gets his oomph. And that's why he can use images like the North. You know, like we're doing exactly what we've always done in Canada. And it fits with our overall image of ourselves. And so we can use those images. I think that's part of, and we need to be thinking about how we can take those images back and say, you know, we have a compassionate Canada, a history of being compassionate, and we can actually use those images in a different way. And there are different options in that.
I too asked the same question, and I've been asking that same question for a long time. And unfortunately, you know, I don't think anybody, one person or one group, you know, have an answer. We have to come together. We have to work. And we have to do everything we can on a daily basis as well, because as big as the problem is, right, it starts with us too. So you saw that as well. You know, it's not just so about policy and government and governance and so on. It's about what we do and how we be. And you know, and I wanted to give you an example of how difficult it is to see and talk about, you know, respecting people's individuality or rights and so on and so forth. I mean, when you see somebody washing the driveway, or you know, I mean, or the sidewalk, when we know that there is water shortage and so on and so forth, and you see people in Canada washing the driveway. I mean, you know, and so I can guarantee you those are probably people who support politicians. And I want to be very careful with this because, you know, Kairos, we cannot be partisan, so we have to be clear that we are speaking in general to all political parties and all politicians, anybody who is in a power position or responsibility, to speak to everybody in general, because they have the responsibility to implement the policies and the legislation that is necessary in order to revert and stop what's going on right now. But yes, the questions are there. I mean, I asked the same thing when I first came to this country. How can you elect the same government again when they have done everything that they've done? And they didn't. And again, I had to you know, I can't mention names, but people do it. And I was asking, I don't understand it, but so we have to keep talking. We have to keep working. Unfortunately, it's a long life. I mean, how do you say it? It's a lifelong commitment. I thought it was just a matter of a few months or days. You know, we're gonna have to do it all until we die, probably. And even after death, we're not gonna rest in peace because this thing is gonna continue. There were some other questions there.
Sorry, I just wanted to respond to what you just said. I just want to remind everybody that last year we had the majority of our politicians who voted for a bill that acknowledged the targets that the scientists say that we have to hit. Unfortunately, it was killed in the Senate by the Conservatives. So to say that we don't have any politicians who care is actually incorrect. There are a lot of politicians who care. There's big problems with our system that needs correcting. I am a big believer in a proportional representation. I think that we have a coalition government between the NDP and the Liberals, and I hope that they can put forward a proposal, a bill on proportional representation. But it's like steps at a time, and we have to keep pushing. There are a lot of Canadians who care about the environment. There are polls out there that suggest this, and I think what the failure in the environmental movement is this. We have painted the nightmare. We have to paint a picture of what we are pushing for. We have to paint a picture of a beautiful, sustainable future that people want to achieve. And I think that that is our challenge. Anyway, that's it.
I know there's an incredible amount to talk about. Another area of disagreement. I mean, I agree with everything you said, but I do disagree with the statements about political system and economic system. I think it's essential to really understand that. And for that reason, I feel quite critical of the film, actually. I felt disturbed in the very beginning that they, with the choice of people that they interviewed, with Gingrich, Nancy Pelosi, John Kerry. There's a very disturbing assumption too that I think that gets unexamined, which is the aspect of it being a national security or international security issue. Many flaws with that, but I think the direction that we have to be concerned about is the military, the investment in the military per se, but also that is probably being seen as the solution. That people will deal with the human impact in a military security way. The wall that's going up, or has gone up between the U.S. and Mexico, the wall between India and Bangladesh. The model of walls, obviously, from Israel-Palestine. It's just really disgusting way to see people and to treat people. We just did an open letter that, if you're connected with the university, you can look at the Science for Peace website and sign it. But one of the things that we bring to it, it's about climate change, is the little known fact, or at least it's not addressed very much, about the military exemption under Kyoto, which was finagled by Al Gore, actually, that he got an exemption so that military emissions are exempt. So the military is the biggest industry in the United States. The military is also outsourced, so that even if that classified information were available, which is not about the actual military missions, you're still only looking at about half of it. But even if every consumer changed, their style of life, that's not going to really make a dent, because the military missions are so huge. I think it's a mistake to constantly focus on consumerism, because the big emitters are it deflects from the big climate criminals and the big sources of emissions. Another little omission, in the film, for instance, is like they talk about the dams. The World Bank did, kind of touts itself because they did a big study on dams, but they didn't accept it. The dam study recommended, severely limiting the investment in dams, or not investing in dams at all. But the World Bank continues to do that, certainly in Africa. The other thing in terms of Africa, of course, is the land grab. It's like saying, poor people in Africa, you're going to, suffer because of lack of water and lack of food. But meanwhile, there's the land grab, but there's also the U.S. military, command, central command, that they set up a command base in Africa. So these kinds of political, realities really need to be integrated in the environmental thinking, which they're not.
Just a couple things. I fully agree with everything you just said. It's interesting when you go to the Climate Refugees website, and you go to the last tab for things you can do. It's all personal kind of stuff, and none of the political activism that you're suggesting there. The other thing, just highlighting on this too, it's interesting that Lester O. Brown piece again about we were able to mobilize in a very brief period of time to change the whole society around. That mobilization actually instituted the military complex that is part of, that we haven't actually been able to ever demilitarize. So, it's problematic in relation to that because it's created a whole industrial movement in itself that is very difficult to get in response to. So, there's all these deeply ingrained patterns on big institutional levels that we need to be confronting somehow. So I agree with what you're saying.